Let's start the book. Educated. Introduction. Breaking the Chains of a Mountain. Tara Westover's remarkable memoir is a profound testament to the transformative and sometimes agonizing power of self-discovery. Raised completely off the grid by radical survivalist parents, she stepped into a formal classroom for the very first time at the age of 17, embarking on an incredible journey that would ultimately cost her the only family she had ever known. This narrative forces us to reflect on what we are truly willing to sacrifice in order to find our own authentic voice. It is a brilliant, heart-wrenching exploration of loyalty, identity, and the monumental courage required to forge your own path in the world. Point 1. A childhood built on scrap. Nestled deep in the imposing shadow of an Idaho mountain known as Buck's Peak, a young girl's entire universe was defined by the jagged edges of rusted metal and the absolute unquestionable word of her father. The world outside this secluded sanctuary was not merely foreign, it was viewed as a sinister enemy waiting in the shadows to strike the faithful. To truly understand Tara's beginnings, we have to look closely at the soil from which she grew. Her father, Gene, was a man consumed by an overwhelming paranoia and a rigid fundamentalist ideology. He believed with every fiber of his being that the government was an inherently evil entity, run by the Illuminati, designed to brainwash children through the public school system and poison citizens through the medical establishment. Because of these deeply entrenched beliefs, Tara and her siblings were denied birth certificates, medical care, and formal education. They were ghosts in the eyes of the state, existing only within the fiercely guarded borders of their family's land. The environment on Buck's Peak was defined by an atmosphere of constant, looming catastrophe. Gene was a doomsday prepper, obsessively hoarding supplies, burying fuel tanks, and canning thousands of jars of peaches to prepare for the days of abomination. This apocalyptic worldview meant that the children were enlisted as soldiers in a war against the end of the world. Their days were not spent learning arithmetic or reading literature, but rather laboring in the family junkyard. The junkyard was a chaotic, incredibly dangerous playground of twisted steel, heavy machinery, and sharp iron. Gene believed that God and the angels would protect his family from harm, a belief that led to a horrifying series of preventable accidents. One of the most striking elements of this early life is the sheer physical trauma the family endured. When Tara's older brother Luke accidentally spilled gasoline and suffered horrific burns down his leg, there was no frantic call to an ambulance. Instead, he was carried down to the basement where their mother, Faye, treated the agonizing wounds with homeopathic tinctures, lobelia, and raw honey. Faye had slowly transformed herself into an unlicensed midwife and an herbalist, not entirely by choice, but because Jean's absolute refusal to interact with the medical establishment demanded it. Every laceration, every concussion, and every broken bone was treated with herbs and prayer. The physical isolation of the mountain was mirrored by a profound psychological isolation. Tara grew up believing that a woman's only righteous path was to become a dutiful wife and a mother, subservient to the patriarch of the family. The stories she was told about the outside world were terrifying. Jean frequently recounted the tragedy of the Weaver family at Ruby Ridge, painting a vivid, terrifying picture of government agents descending on a righteous family to murder them. For young Tara, the world beyond the mountain was a place of slaughter and sin. Yet, despite this indoctrination, there was an undeniable, quiet curiosity blooming within her, a subtle, persistent feeling that perhaps the sky above Buck's Peak was not the only sky worth seeing. Point 2. The spark of rebellion in the dark. It takes an extraordinary kind of bravery to look around at the only life you have ever known, the only reality you have ever breathed, and realize you desperately want something else. For a young girl raised to believe her entire future was already written in the dust of a scrapyard, the simple sight of an older brother packing his bags changed the trajectory of her life forever. The first real crack in the foundation of the Westover family's isolation came from Tara's older brother, Tyler. Tyler was different from the rest of the boys. He preferred the quiet sanctuary of books and music to the deafening roar of the scrapyard's heavy machinery. When Tyler announced that he was leaving the mountain to attend college, it sent a shockwave through the family. Jean viewed this departure as the ultimate betrayal, a surrender to the very forces of evil he had spent his life fighting. But for Tara, Tyler's departure planted a powerful, irreversible seed. It demonstrated that leaving was physically possible. Around this time, Tara began to search for small, hidden avenues of escape and self-expression. She discovered she had a beautiful singing voice and began performing in local choir productions. This tiny taste of the outside world was intoxicating. She even took a dance class, an act of quiet rebellion that quickly collided with her father's rigid moral code. When Jean saw the modest dance recital outfit she was required to wear, he was consumed by a righteous fury, branding her with the word whore. This deeply traumatic moment highlighted the impossible tension between Tara's growing sense of self and the suffocating constraints of her father's worldview. She realized that any attempt to exist outside of his strict parameters would be met with hostility and shame. Driven by a desperation she barely understood, Tara decided she needed to escape. The only path out was the one Tyler had taken: education. She purchased a used algebra textbook and began secretly studying in the basement. The process was agonizing. She had no teachers, no foundation, and no one to ask when the equations looked like an alien language. She had to teach herself fractions, decimals, and basic math concepts from scratch, all while hiding her efforts from a father who would see them as a betrayal. The climax of this incredible period of self-discipline was the act. Tyler had told her that if she could score high enough, Brigham Young University BYU might accept her, even without a high school diploma. The morning of the test, Tara drove herself to the testing center, stepping into an environment that felt completely terrifying. She had never taken a timed exam, she didn't know how to fill in the bubble sheets, and she was surrounded by teenagers who spoke a cultural language she did not understand. Yet, against all odds, her relentless basement studying paid off. She passed the exam. She had forged her own key to unlock the heavy gates of Buck's Peak. Point 3. The protector who became the monster. The monsters in our lives rarely announce themselves with bared teeth. They often arrive disguised as saviors, protectors, and friends. When an older sibling returns home from the outside world, the initial relief of companionship can slowly, almost imperceptibly, curdle into a suffocating nightmare of control and violence. As Tara was plotting her escape through textbooks, the atmosphere on the mountain shifted drastically with the return of her older brother, Sean. Initially, Sean was a breath of fresh air. He was charismatic, protective, and seemed to offer a buffer between Tara and the relentless demands of their father. He defended her, joked with her, and made the heavy atmosphere of the scrapyard feel a little lighter. But this honeymoon period was tragically short-lived. Sean suffered a horrific accident, falling from a great height and sustaining a severe traumatic brain injury. Because of the family's absolute ban on hospitals, he was treated at home. Following the injury, a dark, terrifying transformation took hold of Sean. His protective nature twisted into extreme, violent possessiveness. The abuse began subtly, disguised as roughhousing or brotherly discipline, but it quickly escalated into unspeakable cruelty. Sean became the enforcer of the family's rigid moral code, taking it upon himself to punish Tara for any perceived independence or sinful behavior. If she wore lip gloss, spoke to a boy, or showed too much confidence, his retribution was swift and physical. He would twist her wrists until she thought the bones would snap, drag her by her hair down the hallways, and force her head into the toilet, demanding she acknowledge her own perceived worthlessness. What makes this chapter of Tara's life so profoundly heartbreaking is not just the physical violence, but the deep psychological manipulation that accompanied it. Sean would violently assault her and then hours later leave a heartfelt apology and a gift on her bed, claiming he didn't know what had come over him. This cycle of extreme violence, followed by intense affection, created a devastating cognitive dissonance in Tara's mind. She loved her brother, but she was absolutely terrified of him. She began to write in her journal, but even there she censored the truth, minimizing the abuse and blaming herself for provoking him. Perhaps the deepest wound of all came from the silence of her parents. Faye, her mother, saw the bruises. She heard the screams. Yet, bound by her own subservience to the patriarchal structure of the family, she did nothing. She looked away. This silent complicity taught Tara a devastating lesson. Her safety was not a priority, and the illusion of family harmony was more important than her physical well-being. She learned to compartmentalize the terror, burying the trauma deep within herself just to survive the days until she could finally leave for university. Point 4. Stepping off the edge of the world. Crossing the threshold of a university campus for the ordinary student is a celebrated rite of passage, but for someone who has never heard of an essay, a lecture, or a textbook, it is akin to landing on an alien planet without oxygen. The sheer overwhelming terror of the unknown can paralyze even the sharpest and most determined minds. Arriving at Brigham Young University, Tara was thrust into a world for which she was profoundly unprepared. The culture shock was immediate and dizzying. She moved into an apartment with roommates who went to movies, drank Diet Coke, and wore clothing that her father would have condemned as wicked. Tara, still carrying the heavy, judgmental voice of her father in her head, initially viewed these girls with suspicion and righteous judgment. But soon that judgment turned into a deep, isolating sense of inadequacy. She didn't know how to use a standard washing machine, she didn't know that soap was required to wash dishes, and she had absolutely no understanding of basic social norms. The classroom proved to be an even more terrifying battlefield. In her first art history lecture, Tara raised her hand and asked a question that would haunt her for years. Looking at a word on the projector screen, she earnestly asked the professor what it meant. The word was Holocaust. The entire lecture hall fell into a stunned, icy silence. The professor, believing she was making a deeply offensive anti-Semitic joke, stared at her in disgust. It wasn't until Tara went back to her apartment and looked the word up on a rudimentary internet connection that she realized the magnitude of her ignorance. She had lived her entire life completely unaware of one of the most significant and horrific events in modern human history. This moment shattered her. It was a brutal awakening to the fact that her father's version of the world was not just narrow, it was entirely fabricated. Beyond the academic struggles, Tara faced crushing poverty and severe health issues. She was working grueling hours as a janitor to pay for her schooling, barely eating to save money. When a rotting tooth began to cause her agonizing, blinding pain, she refused to go to a dentist, partially because she couldn't afford it, but mostly because she still deeply feared the medical establishment. She pushed herself to the absolute brink of physical and mental collapse. It was during this dark period that the local church bishop intervened. Recognizing her desperate situation, he urged her to apply for a government Pell Grant. To Tara, taking government money was a direct violation of her father's core beliefs. It was inviting the Illuminati into her life. The internal battle was agonizing, but the physical pain and her desperate desire to stay in school finally won. She accepted the grant, went to the dentist, and experienced the profound relief of modern medicine. This was a crucial turning point, a physical and symbolic acceptance of the world her father had taught her to hate. Point 5. Oceans away from the scrapyard. Sometimes you have to travel thousands of miles away from everything you have ever known just to see your own reflection clearly. Standing among the ancient cobblestone streets of England, the rust and dirt of the Idaho junkyard finally began to wash away, revealing a brilliant, capable scholar underneath. Tara's relentless work ethic eventually caught the attention of her professors. Despite her massive educational deficits, her raw intelligence and her unique, unvarnished way of analyzing historical texts made her stand out. She was encouraged to apply for a highly competitive study abroad program at Cambridge University in England. The very idea seemed absurd to her, a girl from a scrapyard walking the same halls as Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. Yet she was accepted. Arriving at Cambridge was a second, completely different kind of culture shock. The breathtaking architecture, the intellectual rigor, and the sheer weight of history intimidated her deeply. She felt like an imposter, a feral child wearing a scholar's clothes. She was assigned to work with Dr. Carey, an esteemed and demanding professor. During one of their early sessions, Tara submitted an essay that she felt was inadequate. Dr. Carey looked at her and delivered a line that would fundamentally alter her self-perception. "You are not fool's gold, shining only under a particular light. Whomever you become, whatever you make yourself into, that is who you always were." This mentorship at Cambridge was the true beginning of Tara's intellectual liberation. Dr. Carey introduced her to the concepts of positive and negative liberty, helping her understand that freedom isn't just the absence of physical chains, but the presence of the ability to take control of one's own mind. As she immersed herself in the study of history, reading about the civil rights movement, feminism, and global politics, she began to deconstruct her past. She realized that her father's teachings were not the absolute truth of the universe, but rather one man's deeply flawed, desperately fearful perspective. The physical distance from Buck's Peak allowed her the mental space to breathe. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the next catastrophe or bracing herself for her brother's violence. She was simply a student. Her academic prowess flourished in this environment of safety and encouragement. She eventually applied for and won the prestigious Gates Cambridge Scholarship, securing her funding to return to England for graduate school. She was no longer just escaping her past, she was actively building a magnificent future. Point 6. The inevitable collision of two lives. We often harbor a quiet dream of returning to our roots triumphantly, bringing our newfound wisdom back to the people we love. But when the soil you grew from is deeply toxic, going home can threaten to destroy everything you have so painstakingly built. The collision between a newly expanded mind and the rigid, unyielding dogma of the past is almost always violent. Armed with new confidence and a broader understanding of the world, Tara traveled back to Buck's Peak for a visit. She desperately wanted to bridge the gap between her two worlds. She wanted to be a Cambridge scholar and a beloved daughter of the mountain. However, the reality of her home had not changed. In fact, the darkness had only deepened. Sean had married a young woman named Emily, and Tara quickly realized that he was subjecting his new wife to the same terrifying cycle of psychological and physical abuse that he had inflicted on her. The simmering tension reached a horrifying climax during a snowy evening. In a fit of rage, Sean handed Tara a bloody knife, a deeply menacing gesture that signaled a level of physical threat she could no longer ignore. Terrified, she locked herself in a bathroom, realizing with crystal clarity that her life was in genuine danger. This was the moment the illusion of family loyalty finally broke. Tara knew she could no longer remain silent. She reached out to her older sister Audrey, who revealed that she too had been horribly abused by Sean. Together, they agreed that they had to confront their parents and stop the cycle of violence. However, when the moment of confrontation arrived, the family dynamic proved too powerful to break. When Tara finally spoke the truth to her parents about Sean's abuse, the reaction was not horror or protection, but immediate, aggressive denial. Jean and Faye refused to believe her. They accused Tara of being influenced by the devil, claiming that her secular education had poisoned her mind and turned her against her own family. The ultimate betrayal came when Audrey, buckling under the intense pressure and fear of being ostracized by the family, retracted her statements and sided with their parents. Tara was left entirely alone, standing against the united front of her family's denial. The gaslighting was so intense and so unified that Tara actually began to question her own sanity. She wondered if she had hallucinated the abuse, if she truly was the villain her parents claimed her to be. It was a psychological breaking point, demonstrating the terrifying power of a shared delusion over a single isolated truth. Point 7. A pilgrimage to save a lost soul. There is a unique, suffocating kind of heartbreak in realizing that the people who claim to love you the most are also the ones most fundamentally incapable of understanding you. When parents cross continents not to celebrate their child's incredible achievements, but to exorcise her perceived demons, the final fraying thread of family inevitably snaps. Following the disastrous confrontation, Tara returned to her academic life, eventually securing a fellowship at Harvard University. On paper, she was achieving the pinnacle of academic success, but internally she was falling apart. The trauma of the family rupture was eating her alive. In a final, desperate attempt to save her soul, Jean and Faye traveled across the country to visit her in Massachusetts. They did not come to see Harvard or to celebrate her fellowship. They came on a religious pilgrimage to bring her back to the mountain. The visit was deeply uncomfortable and filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The climax occurred in Tara's apartment, where Jean presented her with an absolute ultimatum. He told her that she was possessed by evil spirits and that he needed to lay his hands on her head to cast out the devil. If she allowed this, she could be welcomed back into the family fold. If she refused, she would be cast out forever. This was the ultimate test of Tara's education and her newly forged identity. To submit to her father's blessing would be to erase everything she knew to be true. It would mean accepting that Sean's violence was acceptable, that her memories were false, and that her own mind could not be trusted. With agonizing clarity, Tara refused. She looked at her parents, the people who had given her life, and chose her own reality over their comforting delusion. The aftermath of this decision was catastrophic. After her parents left, Tara suffered a profound mental breakdown. The guilt and the grief of losing her family paralyzed her. She stopped attending classes, stopped submitting her academic work, and spent days wandering the streets of Boston or staring blankly at the television. She experienced severe panic attacks, her body physically shutting down from the overwhelming trauma of abandonment. She had won her freedom, but the price she paid was the absolute loss of her origin. She had to navigate the terrifying reality of being entirely untethered in the world. Point 8. The conclusion. Healing is rarely a linear path. It is a messy, quiet, and profoundly difficult process of rebuilding a house from the foundation up after a devastating storm has leveled it. In the end, the accumulation of prestigious degrees and accolades means very little compared to the profound, unshakable ownership of one's own mind. The final phase of Tara's journey is not about achieving sudden magical happiness, but about finding a way to live with the profound losses she had endured. Through the support of friends, the structure of her academic work, and her own immense internal strength, she slowly began to pull herself out of the darkness of her mental breakdown. She completed her PhD, writing a brilliant dissertation on intellectual history, proving once and for all that she belonged in the academic world she had fought so hard to enter. But the truest education she received was not found in the libraries of Cambridge or Harvard. Her true education was the agonizing process of learning to trust herself. She had to learn how to separate the voice of her father from her own internal monologue. She had to accept that it is possible to deeply love people who are fundamentally toxic to your well-being, and that establishing boundaries is not an act of malice, but an act of necessary self-preservation. Today, Tara is estranged from half of her family, her parents, and the siblings who remain strictly loyal to the mountain's ideology. However, she maintains loving relationships with the siblings who also chose to leave and seek their own education. She no longer views her past as a simple tragedy, nor does she view her family as one-dimensional villains. She understands the deep fear that drives her father and the complex subservience that traps her mother. When we look at the entirety of Tara Westover's story, we are left with a powerful redefinition of what it means to be educated. Education is not merely the process of accumulating facts, passing exams, or securing impressive titles. It is the arduous, often painful process of gaining the perspective necessary to see your life from the outside. It is the ability to break free from the narratives written for you by others, whether by your family, your culture, or your society, and to pick up the pen to write your own story. Tara lost the mountain, but in doing so, she gained the entire world, and most importantly, she gained herself.